Hello and welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you online for this conference, and I'm sorry that I can't join you in real time. I'd like to cast your minds back to the early days of the global COVID-19 pandemic. As governments raced to contain the spread of the virus through border closures and domestic lockdowns, international humanitarian actors moved foreign staff out of response contexts and reduced their operational footprints, compelling them to rely increasingly on local capacity to deliver programming. This shift was reflected in the Global Humanitarian Response Plan, or GHRP, the International System's key planning framework for the response. The first global response plan of its kind, it explicitly acknowledged that if done right, the involvement of local actors could provide the blueprint for humanitarian operations in the future. For some in the sector, it seemed clear that the moment for shifting resource and power to local actors had finally arrived. And yet now, 3 years on since the start of the pandemic, we've seen no substantive system-wide change in the role and power of local organisations in internationally funded humanitarian action. The question I'd like to pose to you today is why COVID-19 did not provide the catalyst for wider or longer-term change on the role of local actors. To answer this, I'll be drawing on learning and analysis from 3 key ALNAP workstreams: our 2022 State of the Humanitarian System Report, our work on how change happens in the humanitarian system, and a forthcoming evaluation synthesis on the humanitarian response to COVID-19. I'll begin by exploring to what extent the international response to COVID-19 made space for local participation and leadership. I'll then briefly outline a new analytical framework developed by ALNAP to understand the relationship between learning and change. And finally, using the lens of the learning framework, we'll explore the barriers to change and ask what needs to happen now to ensure future emergency responses can be locally led. So what happened during COVID-19? Looking back now at the pandemic response in 2020 and 2021, it's clear that local actors, grassroots groups, and community volunteers were critical enablers of the pandemic response. They often acted as first responders, shouldering significant responsibility in relief efforts. Local and national actors played key roles in various aspects of the response, including needs assessments, targeting, delivering cash and food supplies to people in quarantine, as well as developing and running COVID-19 sensitization activities and sustaining engagement with communities. There was also significant activity outside of the formal aid system, with local groups self-organising their own efforts and mobilising funding from non-traditional sources. Moreover, local and national actors were responding not only to COVID-19, but also to other ongoing and emerging crises. With so much focus on the immediate health impacts of COVID-19, there was a sense in some countries that ongoing needs were not being adequately addressed, and local organisations played a role in filling these perceived gaps. However, despite this, evaluations suggest that overall the decision-making structures and funding patterns remained largely unchanged. Local and national NGOs continue to receive only a very small proportion of total humanitarian funding. Only 2% of funding mobilised for the GHRP was provided directly to local and national NGOs, and the GHRP did not set a target or ring-fence funding for local actors. Evaluations also highlight that local responders were largely excluded from influencing the design of the COVID-19 response. At a global level, there were limited opportunities for local and national actors to provide input to the development of the GHRP. It was put together rapidly by the IASC in early 2020, but the lack of wider consultation meant it was viewed as largely UN-centric and top-down. At a country level, while some humanitarian country teams made efforts to include local actors in national response planning, in general they were poorly represented in humanitarian coordination structures. In 2020, local and national NGOs occupied just 11% of co-chair positions in the cluster system, and only 6% of humanitarian country team membership positions. Our review of the evaluative evidence shows that international agencies tended to delegate specific responsibilities to local partners in accordance with their own priorities and choices, and often relied on local partners they previously worked with. Overall, despite the indispensable contribution of local actors in the response, initial hopes that COVID-19 would bring the sector closer to achieving its localisation goals were not realised. One might think that it was perhaps naive to expect meaningful change to come from the pandemic response. However, there was good reason to hope that this change would materialise. Mega crises have a record of catalysing change within the humanitarian system. In particular, the response to the Rwandan genocide, the 2004 tsunami response, and the 2010 Haiti earthquake response, all of which generated momentum for change and prompted a reckoning for the sector on accountability and performance issues. The difference between those experiences and the COVID-19 response led us at ALNAP to ask, why does some learning lead to big improvements while progress in other areas remains stuck? In 2022, to mark ALNAP's 25th anniversary, we invested in a research series looking specifically at learning to better understand the relationship between learning and change. Borrowing from systems theory, we developed the Humanitarian Strategic Learning Framework. It highlights how change in the humanitarian system is brought about by the interaction of factors at 3 levels, which I'll explain in turn. Spaces where new experiences and learning take place are called niches. At this level, old assumptions are tested and innovative approaches are piloted. It's where experimentation takes place and new ways of working are trialled. Some of these are planned beforehand, while others spring up in real time in response to emerging problems. We also seek all kinds of research at this level, different types of evaluations, action research, and so on. In this way, the niches provide a kind of test bed for doing things differently. The regimes level represents the dominant institutional architecture of the formal humanitarian system, which is primarily shaped by donors, the UN, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, and INGOs, all of whom are central to the functioning of the traditional humanitarian business model. Inherent within these institutions are established sets of practices, processes, skills, structures, organisational cultures, and values, all of which are deeply embedded. At the landscape level are the wider contextual factors that shape the sector and the interactions of actors within it. Here we are talking about the international norms that underpin the system and the wider socio-economic and political context in which the system operates. We are also talking about sudden changes in the environment, like the pandemic itself, which shape how crises play out. So putting all these 3 layers together gives us the overall framework, which looks like this. You'll see the arrow across the bottom indicates the passage of time, and the various arrows between the 3 levels represent the interconnections between them. The 3 levels are not discrete spaces, but each one is part of a continuum and they overlap with each other. In this way, the framework emphasizes that the process of learning and change is not linear. Just because you have learning at the niche level does not necessarily mean that you will create change at the regimes level. Rather, changes and improvements in humanitarian action come about as the result of the confluence or alignment of factors across all 3 levels. So, what can the framework tell us about why COVID-19 was not a tipping point for localisation? Let's now take a look at how we can apply the framework to the COVID-19 experience to help us understand what happened and why, and what steps need to be taken to enable future response to be increasingly locally led. Before the pandemic was declared by WHO, the landscape was characterised by a mismatch between rhetoric on localisation and reality. On the one hand, there had been a normative shift in favour of locally led action. In 2016, 63 donors and humanitarian organisations signed up to the Grand Bargain Agreement, which included a specific commitment to providing more support and funding for local and national responders, and a target to provide 25% of global humanitarian funding as directly as possible to local and national actors by 2020. On the other hand, there was strong evidence that very little funding was being provided directly to local and national organisations in reality. In addition, we saw more bureaucracy and scrutiny of the use of public funds, which contributed to increased risk aversion and perverse incentives among donors. Each iteration of ALNAP's State of the Humanitarian System Report has found that the international aid system is neither monolithic nor static, but is clearly resistant to deeper change and transformative improvements. As ALNAP's John Mitchell wrote just before the pandemic, the humanitarian system seems stuck in a kind of functioning inertia. Into this landscape came two disruptors, two major events with the potential to challenge the status quo. The first disruptor was the pandemic itself. Everybody in the aid architecture was affected by COVID-19 at a personal level and a professional level. Where the dominant international actors were used to providing assistance overseas, suddenly they found themselves profoundly affected by the same crisis at home. As discussed, the reliance on local capacity to deliver assistance increased dramatically, and this was supported, at least at a normative level, by various guidance documents produced by the IASC to promote localisation in the COVID response. The second disruptor was the re-emergence of the decolonise aid debate. The subject gained renewed attention and urgency following the wave of Black Lives Matter protests in May 2020. The BLM movement reignited a global conversation about race, colonialism, privilege, and power. This brought to the fore long-standing discussions within the humanitarian system, with many taking the view that the repeated failures of international actors to live up to their commitments is a signal of an enduring colonial and racist legacy. In sum, the scene was set for a shift, but the question was, how comprehensive would it be? Given that the humanitarian system was not monolithic, but capable of some surface adaptation, it's no surprise that there was a significant expansion of local action during the pandemic. The sector was obliged to adapt to the circumstances in which it found itself in order to deliver life-saving assistance. We did see some experimentation and learning at the niche level. For example, there were some tweaks to existing funding models that made them more favourable to locally led action. In general, funding was seen to become more flexible, with donors agreeing to repurpose or pivot existing funds to meet emerging needs. Some local actors reported that they therefore found it easier to receive funding during the pandemic, and this enabled them to respond more flexibly to emerging needs. However, this was not a consistent experience across the board, as many local actors struggled to access direct funding. Similarly, IASC policy guidance encouraged the use of country-based pooled funds to direct funding towards local civil society. In 2020, 36% of total CBPF funding was provided to local and national NGOs, compared to 25% in 2019. Although this represented a small portion of the total funding for the response, it demonstrates that CBPFs have an important role to play in changing traditional funding flows. The proliferation of online spaces also had some positive effects for the inclusion of local perspectives. Online meetings enabled greater participation of local and national actors in coordination mechanisms. But of course, this came with predictable challenges related to technical capacity, particularly the need for a stable internet connection. But overall, it is clear that all of this did not add up to a transformative shift. Despite the opportunity presented by the pandemic to do things differently and the supposed global ambition to support greater localisation, the planning and implementation of the GHRP was concentrated in the hands of the dominant international actors. The expansion of local action was not maintained or consolidated after the immediate crisis had passed and was not accompanied by increased agency and control. While there was a necessary increase in risk appetite during COVID-19 to enable funds to move more quickly and easily, this was seen as an exception. And not all processes became more flexible. For example, due diligence policies continued to place downward pressure on grantees to ensure their local partners met minimum requirements, increasing both risk aversion and reliance on existing partnerships. The structures in place within the system also create practical constraints. For instance, many donors lack sufficient capacity to manage numerous small grants all over the world. Ultimately, the greatest obstacles to increasing locally led action are located at the level of regimes. The most powerful international actors in the system, with the greatest power to bring about reform, have no real incentives to give up or share their power. As one interviewee for the 2022 SOS report said, "The challenge is the lack of willingness to let go, and the fact that most of the international actors, whether they're donors or UN agencies or INGOs, they don't have incentives to let go. And until that incentive structure changes, I don't see much change happening." The structure and culture of the system was simply too rigid and inflexible to enable deep changes in operations during the pandemic. To sum up, because of the inherent structure, culture, and modus operandi of the international architecture at the landscape and regime level, the expansion of local action during COVID-19 was unable to build sufficient weight to tip the balance. For localisation ambitions to succeed, a fundamental reconfiguration of power dynamics within the international humanitarian system is required. Our model tells us that to be able to implement a more locally led response, action needs to be taken at different levels. For instance, at UN level, there is a need to consider how a future global response plan should be developed to ensure sufficient flexibility and diversity of perspectives. INGOs and the Red Cross movement need to keep learning and adapting their partnership models to ensure partners have a strong voice and influence. The donor community needs to review its risk thresholds and ability to incentivize new models. And the research community needs to demonstrate the feasibility and viability of locally led response in different settings in a way that speaks to the priorities and concerns of those who currently hold the purse strings. ALNAP's strategic learning framework shows that change is not a linear process. Change requires collective learning over successive crises. Although specific crises can create windows of opportunity for change at the regime's level, change tends to be built incrementally. It's possible that the roughly 2-year window of intense activity on COVID-19 was not enough to design, test, and embed new approaches, particularly as many organisations went into survival mode. Instead, it may be helpful to consider the COVID-19 experience as one of a sequence of crises that concentrate attention on local action and gradually move the needle. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to hearing your feedback and answering your questions via the conference app. And if you'd like to stay in touch with ALNAP, please do follow us on social media and subscribe to our bulletin.